You read that right, and the title is correct. But before you get out your pitchforks, let me explain. I love Europa Universalis IV. It's probably my favorite game of all time, and I play it and or mod it every single day. But as with everything, it is not without flaws, and I think that the mission tree system might be one of the best and simultaneously worst things Paradox has ever added to this game. Mission trees are packed with flavor, historical narrative, and some incredibly satisfying rewards, but it also quietly kills the sandbox that initially enticed many of us pre-mission tree boomers to the game in the first place. They will tell you what to do, when to do it, and project the impression that there's a correct or optimal way to play the game. Of course, they're not required to play the game, but if you are not using them, then you are playing the game on hard mode. And yet, despite these criticisms, we love them. Just look at Hearts of Iron 4's focus trees. So, what gives? With EU4 sequel Europa Universalis V just over the horizon, there's a chance to evolve the system. And believe it or not, the future of mission systems in the Europa franchise may come from quite the unlikely candidate. We can't talk about EU5 without talking about what made it possible, EU4. And as I mentioned in the intro, EU4 mission trees are a relatively new addition to the game. In fact, they were not added until patch 1.25 with the Rule Britannia DLC in 2018, 4 years after the game was released. Before their introduction, EU4 had missions of a sort. It's essentially the system that they use for the estate agendas now, only it used to be in the Decisions tab. The way that you would choose your mission is you would be given a dynamically created mission, oftentimes based on the situations going on in your country, such as conquering a neighbor, improving a strategic relation, increasing your stability, and so on. They were randomized, sometimes repetitive, but they were mostly disconnected from your unique national identity. Above all, they prioritized emergent gameplay. Players were left to their own devices to make their own goals, and there was no roadmap. The game rewarded creativity, opportunism, and long-term strategic planning. National flavor still existed, but it was primarily through events. The addition of mission trees, of course, increased the amount of flavor possible for each nation by giving it a sort of scaffolding to build upon, but the trade-off was massive. As stated before, mission trees were introduced in the 1.25 update for EU4 alongside the Rule Britannia DLC. Mission trees were part of the free update, but only included a shared generic mission tree that was serviceable but did not provide any sort of divergent gameplay. It was all scripted and predetermined at the very start of the game. And even in this very first patch, you can see the issue arising that I'm talking about with this video, the underlying problem. England and Great Britain received a fully dedicated customized mission tree that gave them some incredible bonuses as well as guided their nation along a sort of soft railroaded approach to the game. But perhaps most importantly, they received very powerful rewards that would set them above and beyond any other nation, and if they were to go through their mission tree, they were going to be uncontested. Of course, this would get better as it was built on in time via DLC missions, but despite the patch being received fairly well overall, there was definitely some grumblings about some issues with especially balance and player agency, and not without good reason. This patch marked the beginning of a shift, a major paradigm shift in the development and the design philosophy of Europa Universalis IV. Initially a massive sandbox grand strategy, with the release of mission trees, EU4 was set on the path of a more scripted sort of gameplay. Obviously, you can draw the comparisons to HOI4 with focus trees, which has been received incredibly well over the years, with HOI4 being an incredibly massive and incredibly successful game, and for good reason. So it makes perfect sense for the developers to take their sister studio's philosophy and port it over into their own game. This shift I'm speaking of, the sandbox to scripted shift, allows countries to become more unique, more flavorful, have some interesting pathways, and possibly even alternate history pathways in the most recent couple of patches, with the trade-off of rigidity in that nation's playstyle. And as you would expect, since their introduction, mission trees have taken the majority of the developers' time and resources rather than adjusting and expanding various features and stuff within the game. Since Rule Britannia, we have received quite a few changes. For example, Emperor, with the 1.30 patch, was, in my opinion, a masterpiece despite its myriad bugs and balance issues on release. They completely reworked the Catholic faith, they added an incredible amount of depth to the HRE, but many would say that the primary thing that 1.30 and the Emperor patch brought was mission trees. In fact, the mission tree for Austria, for example, has its own dedicated achievement. And for the last 2 to 3 years, essentially every DLC that has been released for EU4 has been mission content. Maybe 1 or 2 mechanical changes or introductions here or there, but essentially the focus is all on mission content. And while there is plenty of systems such as estates and government reforms that are more systemic, mission trees are the primary appeal of what brings people in to play specific nations. So I'm sure that you can see where I'm going when I say that the introduction of mission trees, though very cool for specific nations, maybe isn't necessarily the most beneficial thing for the game as a whole, as developer man hours are dedicated to specific nations rather than regional or global systems or mechanics that will benefit the game as a whole rather than the specific nations receiving content. So, in a nutshell, mission trees are great for flavor, bad for flexibility. They oftentimes provide very satisfying content, but they restrict the decision-making process, especially when the rewards are too powerful or conquest-driven. There's also a serious issue with psychological railroading. Even when it's not required, players are going to feel compelled to follow the mission tree path as it would generally be considered optimal or the intended playstyle. And in the worst cases, it literally does lock the player into specific paths. Some trees hardlock key progress behind specific provinces or actions that oftentimes require monumental tasks such as defeating major nations just to progress in the game. This can obviously lead to some pretty severe pacing issues, and in a game where most players don't even play past 1600, that can certainly be an issue. That also leads us to the issue of content primarily being front-loaded in the game, as upwards of 90% of players don't ever play past the age of absolutism. But that's a topic for another day. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that mission trees are a double-edged sword. They undoubtedly contribute to a lot of enjoyment for a lot of people in the game, but simultaneously they remove a lot of enjoyment for a lot of people of the game. I've spent the last 2 years or so working on a mod called Post Phenum. I've created dozens of mission trees for that mod, and I've spent equal amount of time developing other content or systems or mechanics for that mod, but it is so incredibly clear to me, for being in that community Discord for as long as I have, that mission trees are essentially the only thing that the majority of players care about. EU4's official YouTube channel put out a poll just a few weeks ago asking what people's opinions were on mission trees. I'll put it up on screen, but it was something crazy, like 90% of people said, "Oh yes, EU5 must have mission trees, I require them." And while that's not surprising, it's definitely fairly alarming. And at the end of the day, it comes back to Paradox's DLC policy. The general gist is that Paradox Development Studios games are released in a state that is playable, but is not fully realized, or at least released with plans to expand it more in the future. This isn't inherently a bad system, as it does allow these games to have a very long tail and make a lot of money in the long term. Despite having literally no official support for like over a year at this point, I am sure EU4 is making them many dollar dues. And this is due to the DLC that they sell. The major issue with this is that EU4 has been out for 11 years and has a lot of DLC. So it is inevitable to believe that EU5 is going to release, and the content parity is going to be an incredibly high mountain to climb, especially for players who may have higher standards for what they want to see on a release version of a Paradox game. I mentioned this in my initial review, but it's unreasonable to expect the game to have one-to-one parity. I don't know how big the team is exactly, but I assume it's along the lines of 30 or so people. And it is incredibly unreasonable to expect 30 or so people to develop a game as expansive and robust as EU4, while also adding all of the new features and balance and everything else that they're adding in its sequel. While I'm generally much more optimistic about EU5 than I have been about other games in the past, there are certain aspects of it that are undoubtedly going to be quite scripted and quite restrictive to the player. For example, the new situations mechanic is really cool, but it is essentially disasters that are shared across multiple nations. Of course, there could be dynamic things within those situations, but situations themselves are entirely scripted and will happen regardless of input from the player. Just looking at the daily concurrent players of games like Hearts of Iron 4 shows that scripted content is definitely popular and is undoubtedly more popular than other things like the more sandboxy stuff that you would generally see in older grand strategy titles. Hoi4 focus trees are, by definition, railroady. You go from one to the next in a flowchart style with a few branching missions, but for the most part, it is incredibly railroaded. Again, things are incredibly flavorful, and you can get so granular with how you want to do them, but the more granularity you add, the less player agency you add. But no matter how much you want to detract from the system in Hearts of Iron 4, you cannot deny that it is not loved and successful. And this popularity is going to drive what Paradox is going to be doing with future titles. Scripted content shows that many players really enjoy that storytelling and that structure, the lore building of such nations, even if it does sacrifice freedom. However, and this is where the good news comes in, so boys, take a puff of that copium pipe, because I think we may be in for the best of both worlds on this one. For all of its flaws, and undoubtedly it was very flawed, Imperator Rome had a very interesting take on the mission tree system. There were flowchart based mission trees. However, these mission trees were opt-in. They were modular, they were branching, and arguably most importantly, they were dynamic. And like I said before, they created emergent gameplay opportunities. You would select branches of a mission to take, not because it would railroad you into a specific path, but because you wanted to push to a specific direction, and that mission tree maybe presented some claims that maybe you would need, or some boons to your economy that would specifically increase your likelihood of success in the mission that you personally were approaching. And in a perfect world, these missions will always be contextually accurate to what the player is doing, or that nation specifically. The rewards will be relevant to what they are doing without being super overpowered or telling you that you have to do a specific thing, and are bite-sized in a way that they can be completed within a few in-game years without these long, drawn-out, protracted campaigns, such as conquering half of France just to get claims on the other half of France and a modifier that will give you extra bonuses to combat or something like that. I firmly believe that a system like this is just so good of a fit for a game like EU5, primarily because it does give that direction and that flavor that maybe some people may want, as the localization could probably be dynamic in a way that you would be able to inject maybe specific scripted missions into these mission trees, while at the same time avoiding that annoying railroading that I've been complaining about for the last 10 to 11 minutes. So in conclusion, I would absolutely love, and I think that it would be the best move to put a system like this into EU5 rather than the existing long-form scripted scrollable mission trees that they have in EU4. They are structured, but not entirely scripted, and EU5 could blend that flavor of EU4's missions with the flexibility of the Imperator system. There's much more emphasis on player choice and the relevance of those choices, allowing players to define their goals dynamically or choose thematic paths based on their actual conditions of their ongoing run. And above all, it brings back the sandbox nature of a grand strategy game with story involved, but not the primary focus, which in my opinion will preserve the soul of Europa Universalis by supporting emergent gameplay above all else, while still rewarding the player for going down certain paths that they were already going to anyways. I'm a firm believer in don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and the mission system from Imperator Rome was actually quite solid. Despite Imperator Rome and all of its flaws being considered a massive flop in the big scheme of things and a failure for the Paradox Development Studio, it's important to remember that the lead developer for EU5, Johan Andersson, was actually the lead developer for Imperator Rome. Of course, I'm sure he hated to see his baby that he worked on become known as kind of the laughingstock of the Paradox Development Studio's games, but I really do believe that it will be remembered as a major stepping stone from taking EU4 and bringing it into the modern age with the EU5 and new interesting dynamic mechanics that we are going to love for the next 10 plus years. But yeah, that's my take on it. I'd be curious what you guys think about what I said down below and what you think you'd like to see as far as missions and how they're represented in EU5. I also appreciate you making it all the way to the end. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I hope that you've taken away some good information and insight from it. If you did, make sure that you like the video, and if you haven't already subscribed, make sure you subscribe because there's going to be lots of news covering EU5 in the coming months up to its release, and you're not going to want to miss that here.